In the autumn of 1887, in the cattle shipping town of Callow Creek, Kansas, a woman named Nora Voss walked into the Meridian Saloon at 9:30 in the evening and did not leave until the deed was in her hand. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a card maker from Cincinnati, and she had ridden 3 days from Wichita with $11 and a carpet bag that held 2 changes of clothes, a set of engraving bournes her father had wrapped in chamois cloth, and a letter from a lawyer she had not yet answered. She wore a cream calico dress with small blue flowers at the collar, a red wool shawl against the October cold, and the particular expression of a woman who has learned to keep her intentions to herself. The man she had come to see was already dead. Harlan Cade, proprietor of the Meridian, had died 3 nights before in the saloon's back office with a whiskey glass in one hand and an unpaid marker in the other. The town had been watching the Meridian ever since, waiting to see what became of it. The saloon sat at the center of Callow Creek's commerce the way a stone sits at the center of a pond. Whatever happened to the Meridian would send ripples in every direction. Nora had heard about Cade's death from a drover passing through Wichita who had mentioned it as a curiosity rather than a catastrophe. She hadn't known Cade. She had known only that he was a gambler, that he ran a saloon, and that the news of his dying had arrived in her ears at a moment when she had very little to lose and a great deal she needed to find. If you have ever watched a person walk into a room that does not yet know it belongs to her, leave a thought in the comments below. The story that follows is long and patient, and the truth at the end of it took a woman's lifetime of learning to uncover. Nora's father had been Emmett Voss, a maker of playing cards in Cincinnati for 31 years. He had not been a rich man. He had been, in the accounting that matters more, a precise one. He knew paper stock the way a physician knows bone, by feel and resistance, by the way it held a crease and the way it yielded under a blade. He could identify the mill origin of a sheet by its tooth and its weight, and he could identify a crooked card within 30 seconds of touching it, because a crooked card had been handled differently than an honest one. Its surface disturbed in ways the untrained finger could not isolate but could not entirely miss either. He had taught Nora everything, not because he expected her to enter the trade, but because he believed that useful knowledge had no proper sex, and that a person moving through a world full of games ought to know when the game was rigged. He had taught her to feel the slight bevel on a card that had been shaved at its edges, so that a dealer could control the cut. He had taught her to feel the sand-finished nicking that marked a high card at its corner, invisible to the eye but readable to the trained thumb as clearly as a brand on a calf's haunch. He had taught her to identify a daubed card, one whose back had been touched with a chemical preparation that changed its surface texture at a particular spot, so that a player with the knowledge could read the back of any card his opponent held. Her father had died in the spring of 1886 of pneumonia in a rented room in Cincinnati. He left Nora his tools, his notes, and a debt of $62 to a landlord who was not unkind about it. She had worked the debt down through the following year, taking whatever employment was offered, alterations and mending at a dry goods concern, copy work for a printer, and one season of keeping books for a millinery shop whose owner had more inventory than sense for figures. By the autumn of 1887, she had cleared the debt, saved $11 beyond it, and received the letter from the Kansas lawyer, whose client was a gambler named Cade, who ran a saloon in a cattle town called Callow Creek. The letter was businesslike and brief. It informed her that Cade of Callow Creek, Kansas, had wagered the Meridian Saloon against a debt of her father's in a game of cards played in Cincinnati in October of 1885. Cade had won that game, and with it, the debt. The letter further informed her that Cade had died on the 13th of October. 1887, and that under the terms of the wager as notarized and filed, the original debt reverted upon Cade's death, with interest, to his estate. Since Nora was Emmett Voss's only heir, she was invited to appear and to settle. The lawyer's letter implied that settlement meant payment. Nora read it a second time and concluded that it meant something else entirely. She folded it, placed it in her carpet bag, and began to pack. Callow Creek in October had the particular quality of a place that runs on commerce and would rather not examine how that commerce is conducted. The cattle shipping had slowed for the season and the town was contracting around its remaining trade. Its 2 hotels, 4 saloons, a bank, a hardware concern, and the railroad office with its eastward-facing windows. Main Street ran 300 yards from the depot to the edge of a creek bed that had gone dry in August and not yet recovered. The buildings on the south side caught the afternoon sun and the ones on the north side did not. And you could tell a great deal about any given business in Callow Creek by which side of the street it occupied. The Meridian sat on the south side mid-block, with 2 wide front windows and a porch that extended over the boardwalk by 6 feet. The sign above the door had been painted in gilt letters on a dark green ground and had weathered to the point where the gilt read more as suggestion than declaration. But the letters were still legible to anyone who cared to look. The Meridian was the largest of the 4 saloons and the only one with a second story, where 3 card rooms and a private office occupied the space above the main floor. Cade had run the place for 11 years. He had come to Callow Creek from somewhere east. The stories varied as to where, and he had bought the Meridian from a man who had overbuilt it for the town's then smaller population and found himself unable to fill it. Cade had filled it. He had a talent for making a room feel like the right place to be on a given evening, which is not a simple talent, and not an honest one in the hands of a man who has arranged the room's games to his own advantage. The town had known, in the imprecise way that towns know things they prefer not to examine, that the Meridian's card rooms were not entirely sporting. The knowing had not produced any remedy. Cade had been a man of formal courtesy and considerable patience, and those 2 qualities deployed together over 11 years can discourage scrutiny as effectively as any lock. Nora arrived on the evening stage and went directly to the Meridian. She did not stop at a hotel first, because she did not want to give the town time to form an opinion of her before she had formed one of the saloon. The stage left her and 2 other passengers at the depot, and she walked the length of Main Street in the early dark with her carpet bag over one shoulder and the red shawl pulled close against the wind off the plains. A few men on the boardwalk took note of her in the way that men in small towns take note of strangers, not with hostility, but with the particular attention of people for whom a new face is an event worth filing. She did not return the attention. She had her eye on the south side of the street and the gilt letters above the Meridian's door. The man behind the bar was a large, slow-moving person named Aldous Webb, who had been Cade's barman for 6 of the 11 years, and who regarded Nora's entrance with the particular expression of a man accustomed to surprises he is not paid enough to explain. The Meridian's main floor was longer than it was wide, with the bar running down the left side and 6 tables of various sizes filling the middle. A staircase at the back led to the second floor. The ceiling was stamped tin, painted a dark cream that had yellowed with the years, and the lamps along the bar wall cast a warm, imprecise light that was better for the saloon's atmosphere than for seeing anything clearly. 3 men sat at the 2 nearest tables. They had the look of men who had been there long enough to have opinions about who else was in the room, and they formed one about Nora quickly. She walked to the bar and set her carpet bag on the floor. Webb told her that Cade's lawyer, a Mr. Prentice, had his office 2 streets north, and that the saloon was not currently accepting any arrangements regarding its ownership. Nora said she had not come about an arrangement. She had come to see the cards. Webb looked at her for a moment. The three men at the tables had gone quiet. The fire in the iron stove near the back wall made the only sound in the room for a second or two. Then Webb said that Mr. Prentice had possession of the office upstairs and that she would need to speak to him. She said she would do that in the morning. She asked whether there was a hotel nearby that was honest in its rates. Webb told her about the Danforth house 2 blocks north, and she thanked him and picked up her bag. She was at the door before one of the men at the tables said, in a tone pitched to Carrie, that the Meridian was not in the market for new managements. Nora did not turn around. She said that was fine, because she was not in the market for a saloon that needed managing. Then she walked out. She had said it because it was the truest thing she could say at that moment, which was that she did not yet know what she was in the market for. She had ridden 3 days on the strength of a letter from a lawyer and an instinct that something in that letter was wrong, and the instinct had not yet given her a shape for what she would do, if it turned out to be right. She needed to see the cards first. Everything else would follow from the cards. She spoke to Prentice the following morning. He was a compact man of 50, with a dry manner and the habit of adjusting his spectacles when he was choosing his words carefully, which he did often in the 20 minutes she sat across his desk from him. He explained that the estate had obligations, that the saloon carried some debt against it, not ruinous but not insignificant, that the wager document naming her father's debt had been part of a portfolio of such instruments that Cade had accumulated over the years, a practice not uncommon among men of his profession. Nora asked what the saloon's debt amounted to. $430, Prentice said, against which Cade's remaining assets, the bar stock and furnishings and the building itself, were valued at something above $1,000. Nora said she would like to see the wager document. Prentice adjusted his spectacles and told her the document was among Cade's private papers, which were in the desk in the upstairs office. He had not yet fully inventoried them. She asked if she might see the desk. He regarded her for a moment the way men regard a woman who asks a precise question when they have expected a vague one. Then he said he did not see why not. The upstairs office was a square room with a single south-facing window that let in the thin October light, and a heavy iron stove that had not been lit since Cade's death. The desk was a good one, walnut, with brass hardware, and a broad working surface that had been kept clear and clean. 3 drawers on the right, a shallow center drawer, a locked lower drawer on the left. The chair behind it was still positioned as a man of Cade's particular bulk would have left it, pulled slightly out and angled toward the window. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. Then she walked to the desk and opened the center drawer. Inside, in 4 neat paper-wrapped packets tied with cord, were playing cards. She did not pick them up immediately. She looked at them. They were the ordinary face of the thing, wrapped the way a card maker wraps finished stock. But there were 4 packets in a desk drawer rather than in a storeroom or behind the bar, which meant they were not inventory. They were something else. She had seen her father keep particular decks in his desk drawer too, but those were samples he had set aside for study, cards with manufacturing defects he was examining, or cards whose mill of origin he was trying to pin down. A working deck belonged behind the bar or in the card room. A desk deck had a different purpose. Prentice was standing in the doorway. He said something about the cards being part of the stock, probably, that Cade had kept some things in the office for convenience. Nora took the first packet from the drawer and untied the cord. She removed the cards and held them in her hands. Her father had said once that the first thing a hand tells you about a deck is whether the deck has been used honestly. A deck that has been shuffled and played and handled in fair play and acquires a particular softness across its whole surface. like a book that has been read. A deck that has been used in a fixed game acquires something different, a pattern of handling that is uneven and deliberate. The softness concentrated at the edges most controlled, the backs at certain corners reading differently from the body of the card. She held the first card and felt its back. The surface was a fine linen finish, the kind made by several mills in the East, not so distinctive that it required attribution. She moved her thumb across the upper left quadrant of the back with the slow, even pressure her father had taught her. There was a difference there, not in the printed pattern, which was a simple geometric repeating in dark blue on cream and which looked perfectly identical to the eye. The difference was in the surface chemistry, a slight resistance where the backing compound had been applied, a drag against the thumb that was not present on the card's unaltered portions. It was subtle. A man who had not spent years learning the feel of unaltered cardstock might have held this card all evening and noticed nothing. She felt the second card, the same resistance in the same location, the third, then the fourth, which had a different treatment. The resistance was along the left edge rather than the upper left corner, and it was finer, almost delicate, the work of someone who had refined his technique over time. She set the packet down on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she opened the second packet. The second packet was the same. The third and fourth were the same. Every deck in that center drawer had been marked, not crudely. The work was careful, almost artful, the kind of daubing that required both a formula and a practiced hand, because the chemical had to change the surface texture precisely enough to be readable but subtly enough to escape a casual inspection. Someone with no training in the feel of playing card stock might have held these cards for an hour and noticed nothing. Her father had spent 31 years in Cincinnati learning this. He had spent 18 of those years teaching her. She noticed everything. If you have ever held a thing in your hands and understood in that moment what it meant for someone else, stay with this story. The answer this woman was building was not one she had looked for. It was one that found her through her hands. She did not say anything to Prentice about what she had found. She rewrapped the cards in their cord and placed them back in the drawer. She asked in a tone she kept carefully level whether the locked lower drawer could be opened. And when Prentice said the key had not yet been located, she said that was fine. She would return in the morning. She went back to her hotel room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about her father. Her father had been a careful man. He had been, in the ways that mattered to him, an honest one. He had not been a gambler. He was not, to Nora's knowledge, the sort of man who sat down at a card table and wagered a debt against his daughter's future. Something about the letter from Prentice had troubled her from the moment she read it, and she had ridden 3 days toward that trouble without being able to name it exactly. Now she could name it. The wager document that Prentice held, the one that said her father had gambled away a debt in a card game in Cincinnati in October of 1885, had been won by Cade in a game played with marked cards, which meant the game had not been a fair one, which meant the deed had not been won. It had been taken. She thought about this for a long time. Then she thought about what could be done with it, and how, and in what order. In the morning she returned to the Meridian. Prentice was not yet in the office. Aldous Webb was behind the bar, setting out glasses with the slow, unhurried motions of a man who has arrived at a reasonable peace with his work. And he led her upstairs without argument when she said she was going to look at the desk again. The locked lower drawer was her first question. She tried it with a letter opener she found in the center drawer, and found that the lock was a simple one, a warded box lock of the type made in quantity in the 1870s, with a key profile she recognized from her father's workshop, where a similar lock had kept his chemical supplies. She spent 10 minutes with the letter opener and a piece of stiff cardstock, working the ward with a patience she had developed as a child, watching her father open seize mechanisms in the machinery of his trade. The slow pressure and the careful listening for the shift of the bolt, rather than the force that breaks what it cannot move. The drawer gave with a sound like a brief exhalation. Inside the lower drawer there were papers. Not the casual accumulation of a businessman's correspondence, but organized material, sorted and kept in a way that suggested they mattered to their owner. There were wager documents, 17 of them by her count, each naming a debtor, a sum, and a game played. The papers were in good order, each folded twice and stacked with the most recent on top, the oldest at the bottom, a filing habit that spoke of long practice and the expectation that these instruments would need to be consulted, produced, and returned. There was a small notebook, the pages filled in a precise hand that was not a ledger of honest winnings. It was a formula book. It recorded the preparation and application of the marking compound Cade had used on his cards, the concentration, the instrument used, the part of the card's back treated, and a key to what each treatment signified. High cards were marked at the upper left corner. Aces were marked additionally at the lower right. Picture cards received a different treatment along the left edge. It was a complete system, carefully developed and carefully recorded, because its author had taken pride in it. The earliest entry in the notebook was dated 1876. The most recent was from September of 1887, 3 weeks before Cade's death. Nora read the notebook twice. She did not hurry. The stove in the corner had gone cold and the room had taken on the particular chill of an October morning in a building with no fire. But she did not notice the cold. She was reading the way her father had taught her to read a technical document, for what it assumed you already knew, which was often where the most useful information was held. What the notebook assumed was that its author knew exactly which decks were marked and kept them separate from the honest stock he used to open games and settle disputes. It assumed that he used the marked decks selectively, in games where the stakes were high enough to justify the risk of detection, which was low because the people he played with did not have the knowledge to detect what he had done. It assumed that the formula and the application technique were stable enough to be reliable across hundreds of games over 11 years, which the notebook's own progression confirmed. The entries became more abbreviated as the years advanced, shorthand for a procedure that had become so familiar it needed only reminders, not instructions. A man who has practiced a fraud for 11 years has not made a mistake. He has made a system. Among the wager documents, she found her father's. The handwriting on it was not her father's. The signature at the bottom was her father's, in the particular backward-leaning hand he had used all his life. But the body of the document was in a different hand entirely, neater and more vertical, the hand of someone accustomed to preparing formal instruments. She had 2 letters from her father in her carpet bag. She took them out and compared the handwriting. The comparison took 30 seconds. Her father had not written this document. He had signed it. He may not have known what he was signing, or he may have been told it was something other than what it was, or the circumstances of the game and the drink and the company may have made it seem reasonable at the time. He was not, in the end, an infallible man. He was a careful man who had had one bad evening in October of 1885 and had signed a piece of paper that a man with marked cards had put in front of him. She gathered the wager documents, the notebook, and the marked card packets from the center drawer and carried them downstairs. Aldous Webb was wiping glasses. He looked at the papers in her arms and said nothing. She sat down at a table near the window where the light was good and spent the next 2 hours reading everything carefully and making notes on a sheet of paper she had brought in her bag. At some point, Webb set a cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked. and she drank it without looking up. Prentice arrived at 10 o'clock and found her at the table. He looked at the papers and the notebook and the cards with the expression of a man who has just revised his estimate of a situation considerably. She told him what she had found. She said it plainly, the way her father had taught her to read a sheet of paper stock, by its characteristics, not her feelings about them. She described the marking system in the terms the notebook used, the treatment at the upper left corner for high cards, the secondary treatment at the lower right for aces, the edge treatment for picture cards. She described the feel of the compound under the thumb. She held out one of the marked cards and placed Prentice's hand on its back and guided his thumb across the upper left quadrant and watched his face register what his untrained thumb could not quite name, but could not entirely dismiss. She described the formula notebook, its date range of 11 years, the abbreviated shorthand of its later entries that indicated long practice. She described the 17 wager documents in the lower drawer and the 9 whose body text was in a hand other than the signatories. Prentice adjusted his spectacles 3 times while she spoke and did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The Meridian's main floor was filling below them, the sounds of the morning trade coming up through the floor in a muffled way, glasses and voices and the scrape of a chair. A wagon went by on the street outside. Prentice took off his spectacles and polished them with his coat pocket's cloth in the systematic way of a man buying himself a few seconds to think, which she recognized because her father had done the same thing with a different gesture, smoothing the front of his apron when he was working out how to say something difficult. Then he said that this was a serious matter. She said she was aware of that. He asked what she wanted. Nora set down the papers and considered the cup in her hands, which was empty now, and the October light on the table, which was the particular pale gold of a season turning over. She said she wanted the wager document naming her father discharged. She wanted the other 8 documents in which the body text matched it, likewise discharged, because the people who had signed them had been cheated the same way her father had. She wanted the marked cards and the formula notebook held as evidence in any proceeding that followed. And she said that she recognized the estate had a debt of $430 against the Meridian's assets, and that she would work that debt as the saloon's manager until it was cleared, after which the saloon's ownership would be reconsidered in light of what the records showed. She did not say she wanted the Meridian for herself. She did not say she wanted Cade punished, which was in any case beyond anyone's reach now that he was dead, and the relevant jurisdiction was not one she had standing in. She said she wanted what had been taken from 9 people to be acknowledged as taken, and the instruments of that taking retired. Prentice looked at her for a moment. He was a lawyer in a cattle town in 1887, and he had seen many things come across his desk, and the woman sitting across from him was not like most of them. He said he would need time to review the materials she had identified. She said she would be at the Meridian. She was at the Meridian for 11 months. It was not a comfortable 11 months. The saloon had been running on inertia since Cade's death, and inertia was not a management strategy. There was a barman who worked and 3 who did not. There was a card room on the upper floor that had been used on alternate nights for honest games and on the intervening nights for something else, an arrangement she ended in the first week by the simple method of going to Prentice's office and having him write a notice that all gaming on the premises was suspended pending the resolution of the estate, which was true enough. The men who had been running the room on the dishonest nights came to the Meridian the following Friday, looking for a conversation about it, and she had one with them, brief and without ornament, at the bar, with Webb present and the notice from Prentice in her hand. They left without a formal dispute, which told her something about how much of their authority had depended on Cade's being alive to backstop them. There was a supplier of whiskey who had been delivering short measure for at least 2 years, which she caught by comparing the delivery receipts to the bar inventory over 3 weeks. The receipts said 12 cases. The inventory said the equivalent of 10 and a half. She went back through the receipts she could find and calculated the discrepancy over 18 months at roughly 22 cases, worth at a conservative estimate something between $40 and $50 in stock not delivered. She wrote the supplier a letter that named the figure and the method of calculation and the date range. He wrote back denying it. She wrote again with the specific receipts numbered and cited. After a third exchange, he sent a credit note for $30, which was not the full amount, and which she accepted because the correspondence itself, filed in Prentice's records, was worth more to her than the remaining difference in any future dispute. She found a different supplier and ended the arrangement. The accounts were the part of the management she found most familiar, because accounts are ultimately a record of what actually happened, and what actually happened can always be distinguished from what someone claims happened if you are willing to sit with the numbers long enough. Her father had kept meticulous records for the same reason. A number that does not add up is an argument, and an argument made by numbers is one that does not require anyone's cooperation to make. She hired a cook for the back kitchen, a woman named Ida Crane, who was 50 years old and who had been cooking for the Callow Creek Railroad Depot since her husband's death 7 years before, and who wanted better hours. She hired a second barman, a young man named Rufus Cole, 22, from a ranch family 20 miles east of town, who had decided ranching was harder on the body than he had planned, and who proved to be both quick and reliable. The second-floor card rooms she kept closed. The space above the bar, she decided, could wait until the legal proceeding was settled before it became anything at all. Aldous Webb turned out to be one of the 3 people she could rely on from the beginning. He was not quick and he was not clever, but he was honest about what he knew and what he did not. And a man who knows his own limits is more useful than one who pretends he has none. She kept him. He did not ask her many questions about what she was doing or why, which she valued. On a November afternoon when the wind came off the plain and the temperature dropped by 10 degrees in an hour, he brought a second load of wood for the stove without being asked and stacked it by the bar wall and said nothing about it. That was the kind of person he was. She had known a few of them in her life and recognized them quickly. The legal proceeding moved slowly, as such things do. Prentice, to his credit, did not attempt to suppress what she had found. He took the marked cards and the notebook to a colleague in Wichita who had some expertise in gaming fraud, and the colleague confirmed in writing what Nora's hands had already told her. The cards were marked with a daub compound applied in a consistent and purposive pattern that corresponded exactly to the key in Cade's notebook. Of the 9 debtors whose wager documents had been prepared in the non-debtor hand, 7 were living and could be located. The other 2 had died, one in a ranch accident and one of a fever, and their debts died with them in any practical sense. Of the 7 living debtors, 4 came forward when Prentice's office contacted them. 3 did not respond. Nora did not know what those 3 had decided about the matter, and she chose not to press it, because a choice freely made is a choice freely made. The 4 who came forward included a man named Gerhardt Sells, a grain merchant from the south of the county, who had signed a wager document in 1884 naming a debt of $215. He was a spare, deliberate man of 60 who had been carrying the weight of that debt for 3 years and had paid down $140 of it before Cade's death had frozen the account in Prentice's hands. He came to the Meridian on a Tuesday morning in January, and Nora brought him into the back room and showed him the documents and explained what the formula notebook recorded. Sells looked at the materials for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the cup of coffee that had appeared at his elbow, and he looked at the window, and he said, very quietly, that he had not thought himself a foolish man, but that he had thought perhaps he was one. Nora said that a man who cannot feel a marked card is not a foolish man. He is only a man who was not taught what she was taught. That was one of the longest speeches she made in 11 months. She generally preferred the work to the words. By March, the debt against the Meridian's estate had been reduced by $401 through her management of the place, and by the first week of April, it was cleared entirely. Prentice had, in the interim, discharged the 9 wager documents into a filed record that named them as instruments of fraud. The 4 debtors who had come forward received written notice that their obligations under those documents were void. The marked cards and the notebook were held in Prentice's files. The question of what happened to the Meridian itself was, in the end, a quieter one than Nora had expected. The estate had no other heir. The saloon's value, cleared of its debt and operating at a small monthly profit under her management, was roughly $1,100 by the spring of 1888. Prentice produced a document that was, in practical terms, a transfer of the property to the nearest surviving creditor of the estate's proven fraud, which the court in Wichita reviewed, and which was not contested by any party with standing to contest it. Nora did not celebrate when she signed the transfer document. She read it twice, confirmed the figures, and signed it in the same backward-leaning hand her father had used all his life, and that she had learned from watching his pen move across paper when she was small enough to stand at his elbow without reaching the tabletop. She had not come to Callow Creek to own a saloon. She had come because the letter from Prentice had told her something was wrong, and because she had been taught the difference between a fair card and a marked one, and because the distance between those two things, when someone capable of measuring it was present, was not as wide as those who relied on it had always supposed. The Meridian ran as an honest house under Nora Voss's management for 22 years. She retired the card rooms on the upper floor after 2 years and used the space for storage and, eventually, for a small reading room that served the town's working population on quiet evenings. The bar stayed. The whiskey was measured correctly. The accounts were kept in Nora's hand, which was neat and particular, and which an auditor from Wichita who reviewed them in 1901 described in his report as among the most orderly he had encountered in a town of Callow Creek's size. Aldous Webb worked the bar until 1903, when his legs gave him trouble, and he retired to a house 2 streets south, with a garden he maintained with the same slow, unhurried care he had brought to the glasses each morning. He and Nora had a particular understanding of the kind that doesn't require much speech. 2 people who know what the work is and do it. Sells came back to the Meridian one afternoon in the summer of 1888, not on any legal business but to drink a cup of coffee and tell Nora that he had been sleeping better than he had in 3 years. He said it simply, the way a man says a true thing when he has decided it is worth saying. She said she was glad to hear it. They did not say much else. The formula notebook and the marked cards remained in Prentice's files until his retirement in 1904, at which point they were transferred to the county record office in a sealed case. They are there still, or they were when this account was last verified. The notebook's cover had faded from green to the color of old grass, and the cards in their paper packets had stiffened with the years, but they remained legible to anyone who knew how to read them. Nora kept one thing from the Meridian's back office when she cleaned it out in the spring of 1888. It was a small brass inkwell, heavy and plain, that had sat on the corner of Cade's desk for at least a decade by the look of its tarnish. She did not know why he had kept it there, or who had given it to him, or whether it had ever meant anything to anyone other than herself. She cleaned it and set it on the desk in the back office, which was her desk now, and it sat at the corner where she could see it while she worked, a small, heavy thing that asked nothing and said nothing and simply remained. Her father had said once, while teaching her to feel the edge of a shaved card, that the best thing you can do with knowledge is not to hoard it and not to squander it, but to use it at the moment it is needed and nowhere else. She had held that teaching for 18 years by the time she walked into the Meridian, and she had used it at the moment it was needed, in a room with a south-facing window and 4 packets of marked cards in a desk drawer. And she had not done it for profit or for vengeance, but because a thing wrongly taken deserved to be named as such, and because a name, in the right record in the right hand, carries more weight than most people who have never had to rely on one will ever understand. The brass inkwell sat on the corner of her desk for 22 years. On the morning she turned the Meridian over to the young man who bought it in 1909, she wrapped the inkwell in the chamois cloth from her carpet bag, the same cloth her father had used for his burns, and she placed it in her bag and took it with her. It was the only thing she took. If you know someone who was taught to tell the honest thing from the false one, and who used that teaching when it counted, leave their name in the comments. There are more of them than the record shows, and the record is always better for having them in it. And if this story found you at the right moment, there is another one waiting, about a woman and a sealed thing that held more truth than anyone expected.